Hello, and welcome to Autology, the weekly podcast that brings you the latest on automotive technology. This week's episode is called A Fuel's Errand, Will Hydrogen Cars Ever Be Mass Market? And you're here with me, Rebecca Bellchambers, Thermal Research Analyst, and today's guests, Mike Southcott, Propulsion Assistant Manager in the Light Passenger Vehicle team, and Greg Jeanette, Heavy Truck Senior Research Analyst. Thank you guys for joining me. So let's jump right in with the first question. Mike, what are your high-level views on the use of hydrogen internal combustion and fuel cell?
Okay, brilliant. Thanks for having us, Rebecca. In terms of the high-level view, certainly from a light-duty market, I think at a high level, there is a market for this. I think for hydrogen to come into the light-duty area. I think there's been a lot of investment and development in battery electric vehicles over the last few years, and that almost has its segments. You know, if we say A through to C/D segments, I think they're set now in terms of battery electric. I don't think fuel cells or hydrogen will really enter those. It's when you get into this sort of commercial vehicle, maybe the bigger EF segment type vehicles. And to be clear here, on the light duty side, we're going up to 6 tons. So the sort of fleet commercial vehicles, there's a potential market for hydrogen. It gives you range. It gives you perhaps slightly different options, and perhaps to keep the fueling infrastructure that we've got relatively similar. And like I said, there's two ways that OEMs and manufacturers seems to be going about this. One is the fuel cell, so the stack, the tank, with a battery and a motor, so similar to a BEV platform. And then there's the view that you could run a hydrogen combustion engine. And someone like Toyota have recently announced their plans to develop this, and to potentially look into whether that's a viable route for the light duty market. But I think really the real ramp up and the real area where hydrogen has its potential is in the medium heavy duty. Would you agree with that, Greg?
Yeah. Hi, Mike, and thanks. So yeah, I think at a high level, our view on medium and heavy commercial vehicles for hydrogen, anything hydrogen is, I think we're optimistic on sort of the technology and opportunity, but cautiously optimistic on the timing and the overall ramp up in terms of production and sales and the overall ecosystem, right? So I think there's really three main challenges that the industry is gonna inquire in the next couple of years. So cost, all indications right now point towards these fuel cell trucks being really expensive compared to the diesel counterparts. As you know, in trucking, the operating margins are razor thin. Fleets aren't going to adopt these in huge quantities unless the economics is there. The second would be refueling infrastructure. So right now, one of the main advantages of fuel cell trucks is probably the longer range compared to battery electric trucks. And to really see those benefits, we're going to need more refueling infrastructure across the country, for example, in the United States. Just to give an example, according to the Alternative Fuel Data Center here in the United States, there's only 53 hydrogen refueling stations, just all in California, just to give you sort of a view on how limited the ecosystem is. And that's not even really digging into whether a large Class 8 truck can even get to those, right? So that just gives you a little bit of context. And the third and final would be product availability. We see a lot of investment in ramp within OEMs, but really getting the product on the road and available for fleets is going to take a little bit of time. So to kind of summarize, we're optimistic, but the overall timeline might be lagged a little bit versus battery electric trucks.
Okay, great, thank you. Are you guys able to give us an insight as to what OEMs are developing hydrogen internal combustion engines or fuel cell vehicles?
Yeah, sure. So from a light duty perspective, there's a few announcements recently that come in. So I guess if we look at who's in the market already, it's mainly coming from APAC. So it's Toyota with Mirai, and it's Hyundai with the Nexo. Really are the two big available fuel cell vehicles at the minute. There's a lot of interest in developing these, though. So I mentioned Toyota maybe looking at a hydrogen combustion engine. Recently, I think Ford have applied for a patent on that technology as well. Whether they move to make that into the mainstream will remain to be seen. There's a lot of movement here in Europe. So BMW recently took their iX5 and did some testing on their fuel cell vehicle, some cold weather testing, I believe it was. There's a lot of demonstrators, again, Ford Transit demonstrators. And we've seen Stellantis, we've seen Renault looking at their light commercial vehicles. And I think that's really where the market for this will be. It's the fleet vehicles. Greg spoke about the range. That's really one of the benefits. If you've got sort of a city van that you want to run all day, then perhaps the fuel cell and the range you can get out of it, or if you need to go, from city to city, that's really where this can have its benefits. So, a lot of OEMs working on it, a lot coming here in Europe, and obviously there's a big market potentially in China as well, with OEMs. Certainly, I think Dongfeng are one of the ones there that are keen to move into this. Greg, how does it look on the medium heavy duty side?
Yeah, Mike, that's a good point about the you mentioned, I think, Stellantis. We definitely see that in a wide variety of occasions and in jobs that need to be done with these medium and heavy trucks, that fuel cell will sort of trickle into the lighter classes as well, depending on what the vocation or what the fleet needs, right? But in terms of the overall OEMs, a lot of the global players, let's say, in no particular order, Volvo, Daimler, Packard, Hyundai, definitely, which what you also mentioned, and then there's a wide variety of OEMs in Greater China. But really, I spoke about the timeline a little bit. It really, it's most of the global players, as I said, are investing in trying to get some of these trucks on the road. But I think if I could also just mention two things to give this some context, right? So two of the major global competitors, Volvo and Daimler, actually formed a partnership for R&D purposes for fuel cell electric trucks, and that just kind of goes to show you how this ecosystem is still developing. We have two big competitors, partnering on that, and then at the same time, you have Stratton, who has stated they're not as bullish on fuel cell electric trucks as maybe other players. So, the ecosystem is developing. A lot of global players with reach in all of the major regions are developing these technologies, and that's what we'll see sort of in the mid to long term forecasts as they start to get real products on the road.
Okay, that's really interesting. And a similar question to the last. Do we have an understanding of what suppliers are currently working in the hydrogen space?
Yeah, I think I'll maybe tackle that one. So obviously in supply chain technology, when technologies like this come along, we look to research it, we look to build our forecast. So we do have one coming later this year, which will delve right into the supply chain. So in terms of who's working and what they're working on, there's a few key cost drivers in the fuel cell system and how it's made up. So the big two really are the fuel cell stack and the hydrogen tank. So the fuel cell stack, obviously, within that you've got the cells inside. So you've got bipolar plates, you've got the membrane electrode assembly, so the MEA. So just in terms of some of the suppliers who are looking at it, so there's suppliers like Johnson Matthey who are quite keen and actively working on the MEA side. The bipolar plates, there's a lot of different suppliers that are looking at it, and there's a few technologies there that perhaps could be used on that. The stack integrators and the system integrators, so it's no surprise to see someone like Bosch who are entering this space and who are in there. And then there's a couple of things happening in France. France is one of the key sort of interesting countries, interesting regions where things are happening. So, there's the partnership between Faurecia and Michelin, Symbio, where they're going to use their technologies together. And that will probably be, Greg mentioned about some of the tie-ups with OEMs. Potentially, you'll see some of this with the suppliers maybe looking to produce an entire system, or do the whole system assembly, and probably like we've seen with early days of battery electric, gaining that economies of scale is going to be really crucial here. Again, Greg mentioned the cost. These suppliers have got to make sure that this is viable. So there's a lot of partnerships going on. There's a lot of interest in the area. Who eventually goes into production will remain to be seen. And I think generally in terms of the system integration, the cell integration, I think a lot of OEMs may look to do that themselves or through their sort of subsidiary company. So someone like Hyundai Mobis, working with Hyundai, obviously. So yeah, there's a lot of different suppliers, and the supply chain there is potential there. If we delve a little bit further on, I mentioned the tank. There's obviously the delivery of the hydrogen. So Borg Warner, for example, they announced recently a launch of, I think it was an off-road system, but obviously off-road to on-road, it can be transferable there. So they've launched something, and then there's also the supercharger in there. So companies like Garrett, again, companies like Borg Warner, who've got this sort of traditional turbocharger technology. There's a potential here to keep that going and bring that into this space as well, just on a supercharger level probably. So a lot of suppliers, and a lot of things happening, but it's really about bringing that economies of scale up, I would say. Greg, is that fair from what you understand?
Yeah, no, I wouldn't have much to add on that. I think you're quite the expert in this area. But yeah, the economies of scale and sort of the costs and just the overall ecosystem, I'd really echo and say, we see that as a big opportunity to, ramp up the overall sales and production and momentum in the market. So yeah.
Brilliant. And that leads on quite nicely to my next question, which is what regions can we expect to see driving the hydrogen technology?
So from a light duty perspective, obviously I mentioned APAC, so obviously Japan and South Korea, they're in the space, and they're making lots of noises that they're keen to develop that further. I would say the two regions really on the light duty perspective are probably Europe and Greater China. So if we take Europe, for example, I think that's where we're likely to see our largest ramp up of growth in terms of the forecast length that we've got out to sort of mid 2030s. Europe's where we're going to see the largest scale up of growth, we believe. China is another one where we're going to see a large amount of growth. Greg will probably be better placed to comment on North America, but there's a little bit of growth we believe coming there. But I think the two key regions in terms of growing this in the next 10 to 15 years will probably be Europe and Greater China from a light duty perspective.
Right. Yeah. And I think, from a medium heavy duty commercial vehicle perspective, I think, first understanding, why they would be, driving this technology. I think the regions where we see it the most is where the policy is the strongest, right? Policy that is focused on zero emission trucks, focused on emissions, focused on overall climate change. So we really see the biggest regions, for example, the US, Europe, Greater China is leading this. I don't want to go as far as to say one will be the outright winner, but overall, there's strong policy towards reducing emissions in the transportation sector in all of the main regions, so US, Europe, and China. And in global OEMs that are developing this technology are also in all of these major regions. So I think to that perspective, it's really going to be, maybe in the short term we see, China and Europe, and then US as well in the shorter to midterm. But those are the three main regions where we see this technology taking off first. And in the future, anywhere where there's other stronger policy, that will also be an option for fleets to sort of look at to adhere to all the policy and regulation changes oncoming.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And sorry, just to add in there, I guess in terms of the regional perspective as well, I guess we're talking from an OEM standpoint, but the regions that will probably drive this are where they plan to put the infrastructure in.
Yeah.
We've talked about it being a fleet technology, so perhaps it's a slightly different infrastructure to battery electric or even to what we're currently used to with gasoline and diesel. But that's really going to be what will drive it. It's always that the chicken and the egg scenario. You know, what comes first? Is it the technology? Is it the infrastructure? So certainly if we take in Europe, I think it's Hydrogen Mobility Europe. They've got plans to put a lot of refueling stations across Europe. So that's going to be another thing to be mindful of here as to which regions dominate and how quickly they can ramp that up.
Yeah, sure. Okay. And last question for today. Are you able to give us some insights into our data? I know we've touched on this before, but what is the time frame that we can expect to see a big ramp up in this technology? And do we have any idea of some OEM launch dates?
So from a light duty, just to give you an idea of what we think. So in terms of the ramp up phase to begin with, I think we'll see a little bit in this decade out to 2030, but I don't think it'll be any real substantial growth. I think the growth is going to come, if it's going to come, I think it will be in 2030 to 2040. You know, whether that's early in that portion of the decade, whether it's later, I think that still remains to be seen. How big that ramp up is probably the biggest question that OEM suppliers and the industry is asking and are keen to understand. I've seen figures anywhere from, you know, a few 100,000 to upwards of tens of millions by the end of 2040. So it's still a big question mark, and it's still somewhere to look for. To give you an idea of maybe, you know, the number of OEMs that are in this space, you know, I had a quick look. So if we take 2022 as we are, there's currently 16 nameplates on the market. So 16 vehicles on the market that would run hydrogen fuel cell. By the time we get to 2034, so the end of our forecast horizon, right now we believe that will have risen to 58 nameplates. So, you know, just shy of 4 times the number of vehicles on the market that would run off of a fuel cell. So the investments come in, there is the interest in it. It's just a case of how big that inflection point and how big that ramp up is going to be in the next decade. Greg, would that be for you?
Yes, I would really echo that. And, you know, I think, like I said, we're optimistic, I think, on the technology and the opportunity, but there's going to be a little bit of, you know, some challenges that need to be overcome. Like I mentioned, cost, refueling, product availability. So in terms of, just to give you some data and context on that, our Reinventing the Truck study, which is a deep dive study that's published annually, we look at the longer term, right? And for the United States, fuel cell electric medium and heavy commercial vehicle sales from 2020 to 2030, we have just under 20K total, 20,000 trucks total through 2030. But from 2030 to 2040, we see sales over 120,000 total in that decade. So that just sort of gives you an idea of the timeline we're looking at. The ramp up, you know, after 2030, we see, you know, cost decreasing, economies of scales coming down, and a lot of these OEMs fully having capability to get these trucks on the road. We see also, like, to address the question, a lot of launches coming in the mid 2020s to late 2030s, and that sort of, you know, creates the whole ecosystem from 2030 onwards to be better off for fleets to adopt this technology. So yeah, I would sort of echo that. We see a lot of the adoption coming in terms of sales and production after the 2030.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you, guys. Unfortunately, that is all we have time for today. So I'd like to say a big thank you to all of our guests for joining us today, and to all of you listeners for tuning in. We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's episode at our autology@ihsmarket.com email, and you can find out much more at autotechinsight.ihsmarket.com. Don't forget to hit the subscribe, follow, and like buttons to stay on track with the latest Autology podcasts, and we look forward to you joining us again on the next episode.